Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to explore the topic of intervals in detail. This is a very common term which is used in music, and it's a really important concept because it helps you define and analyze different qualities of sounds, harmonies in music. So when we talk about interval, there are two aspects of it. There's a number of the interval and there's a quality of the interval. So the number is defined by the name of the note. So there are two notes, between the gap between the two pitches or two notes is the interval. So maybe the first note is a C and a G. So the C and the G are fifth apart, and how we count this is this. We start with the C, which is counted as 1, D is 2, E is 3, F is 4, and G is 5. So the interval number from C to G is a fifth. That means that any kind of a C to any kind of a G will be some kind of a fifth. Let's take a simpler interval. Let's talk about C and E. Now C is 1, D is 2, E is 3. C to E is an interval of a third. And that means any kind of a C to any kind of a E will be some kind of a third interval. Whether it's a C to E or a C sharp to E or a C to E flat, C sharp to E flat. So the number comes from the names of the two pitches that we are trying to define the gap between. There is nothing called a zero interval. Minimum number of an interval is 1, which is also known as unison. So this D to the same D is called the perfect unison. When I go from a D to B, I will number the D as number 1, E is number 2, F number 3, G number 4, A number 5, and B number 6. Any kind of a D to any kind of a B will be some kind of a sixth. Whether it's a D to a B, D sharp to a B, D to a B flat, D flat to a B flat, D flat to a B, any kind of a D to any kind of a B is some kind of a sixth. When we come to the quality of the interval, we need to first understand the concept of pitch. What is a pitch? Source of all sound is vibrations, and the number of vibrations per second is what defines a pitch. And the frequency is measured in hertz. You must have heard of the concept of concert pitch. The A above the middle C is 440 hertz. So this is your middle C. The A above it, this is 440 hertz. That means the strings inside my piano are vibrating 440 times a second to produce that pitch. When I go an octave above, when I go an eighth note above, I get the same pitch, but it sounds very different. It is actually not the same pitch at all. The reason why it sounds so similar is because the frequency of this note is exactly doubled when we get an octave higher. So if this is 440 hertz, this A is 880 hertz. Similarly, if I go to the A below, this A is 440, this A is 220, and the A below that is going to be 110 hertz. And in the speakers, you might have seen the term frequency response, and that basically defines the frequency range that a speaker is able to produce. There are companies like Genelac, which actually produce speakers which are capable of producing 15 hertz to 22,000 hertz. Now, why is it important for us to understand the frequency aspect? When we go an octave, the same pitch exactly doubles, and this is in the ratio of 2:1. So the frequency ratio between this C and this C is of 2:1. That means the frequency of this is double of this. When these are sounded together, they produce perfect harmony. There is no clash of frequencies between these two notes. Similarly, when I try to play the C and the G, the first and the fifth, they also produce a perfect harmony. Why is that the case? Because the frequency of the fifth and the frequency of the first are directly proportional to each other, and they are in the ratio of 3:2. Hypothetically, if I say that this C note is a frequency of 200 hertz, this is going to be 300 hertz, and they together produce perfect harmony like this. Similarly, the frequency ratio between the C and the F, or the first and the fourth degree of any major scale, is 4:3. So hypothetically, if I say that this note is 300 hertz, this note is going to be 400 hertz, and together they produce a perfect harmony. There is no clash of frequencies. And this is the reason why the piano tuners use these three intervals, the perfect 8, perfect 5 and the perfect 4, to tune the entire piano. The frequency ratio of the other notes on the keyboard within an octave, like a C to an A or C to an E, they also have different ratios like 5:4, 6:5 and all, but they don't produce a perfect harmony. In fact, a semitone, C and a C sharp, has a very strong clash of frequency, and that clash of frequency of how proportionate or disproportionate it is what we use to identify these intervals by ear. Let's look at the diatonic intervals in a major key. So for the ease of understanding, let's take the C major scale and let's look at all the intervals that exist within this scale from the root note or the tonic. So the C is the first degree, C to D is a major second, C to E is a major third, C to F is a perfect fourth, C to G is a perfect fifth, C to A is a major sixth, and C to B is a major seventh, and obviously C to C is a perfect eighth. In a major key, all the intervals of the degrees of the scale with the root note are either going to be a major or a perfect only. Now that we have understood the perfect intervals and the major intervals in a major scale, kindly note that the interval number 1, the unison, interval number 4, number 5 and number 8. These are the perfect intervals and they can never be a major or a minor interval. That means there is nothing called a major fourth or a minor fifth. These intervals don't exist. Similarly, the interval number 2, 3, 6 and 7 can never be perfect. They can either be major, minor or something else, but they will never be perfect. Basically, interval can be measured by the number of half steps between the two notes. For example, C to D is a tone which is 2 half steps or 2 semitones away. C to E, which is a major third, is 4 half steps away. Any two notes which are 4 half steps away from each other will be called a major third. Similarly, 5 half steps will be a perfect fourth. 7 half steps is perfect fifth, and so on and so forth, till the time you get to an octave above, which is 12 half steps. Now, obviously, the number of semitones counting can get a little complicated when the intervals become large. So we don't typically use that method of calculating the intervals. Let's first understand the relationship between the major, minor, and the perfect intervals. So as I said earlier, the major and minor intervals can never be perfect, and the perfect intervals can never be major or minor. But minor intervals can be derived from the major intervals. For example, let's take a major third. C to E is a major third. This is a gap of 4 semitones. If I reduce the gap of 4 semitones by 1 semitone, I get 3 semitones, and this can be C to E flat, that is a minor third. Also, I can reduce this gap by raising the lower note. Instead of lowering the higher note, I can raise the lower note to reduce the same gap. So C sharp to E is also a minor third. So if you take any major interval and take away 1 semitone from that gap, you will get a minor interval. Let me show you some examples of this. C to A is a major sixth. C to A flat will be a minor sixth. Similarly, C to A is a major sixth. C sharp to A will also be a minor sixth. Any major interval, if you reduce the gap by a semitone, you get a minor interval, and vice versa. When you increase the gap of a minor interval by 1 semitone, you get a major interval. Now that we have understood the perfect and the major and the minor intervals, let's talk about 2 more types of intervals, which are the augmented and the diminished. Unlike the perfect and the major, which can only be certain intervals, like the perfect can only be a unison 4th, 5th and 8th, and major minors can only be 2nd, 3rd, 6th and 7th, any interval can be converted to an augmented or a diminished. To convert a perfect interval to an augmented interval, you need to increase the gap by a semitone. For example, if I have a C and a G, if I raise the 5th by a semitone, C to a G sharp, I'll get an augmented 5th. Similarly, major interval. So if I, for example, take C to A and I raise this A by a semitone, I get an augmented sixth. This gap can also be achieved by lowering the starting note. So for example, if we have a C sharp to an A sharp, this is a major sixth. If I lower the C sharp by a semitone, C to A sharp again will be an augmented sixth. Now the last quality left is the diminished interval, which is achieved by either lowering the perfect interval by one semitone or by lowering the minor interval by one semitone. So let's first look at the perfect intervals and how they can be converted to diminished. C to G, perfect fifth. C to G flat is a diminished fifth. Similarly, C to F is a perfect fourth. C to F flat is a diminished fourth. Now you might be thinking, hey, this is a major third, this is C to E. Yes, it is. But if the notes are named as C to F flat, any kind of a C to any kind of an F is some kind of a fourth. And since C to F is a perfect fourth and we have taken away one semitone from it, technically it is also a diminished fourth. So these are the augmented, diminished, perfect, major and minor intervals. And I would encourage you to try these intervals out on different notes in different keys and see how they work out. Now, by this time, you must be thinking about one thing, that same interval can have multiple names. Yes, like the same note can have multiple names. A sharp and a B flat are the same note, same pitch. So such notes are called enharmonic notes. So A sharp and a B flat are enharmonic of each other. Similarly, the intervals can also be enharmonic. So C to F sharp, which is an augmented fourth, and a C to G flat, which is a diminished fifth, are enharmonic intervals. Hence, augmented fourth and diminished fifth are enharmonic intervals. Major third and a diminished fourth are enharmonic intervals. So there are many ways of naming the intervals, and depending on the context of the music, what key you are in, what key you are modulating to, what kind of a chord you are using, what is the context and the purpose of that chord, these intervals can be named in different fashions. So there are a couple of ways in which you can identify the intervals. So let's look at three commonly used ways of identifying an interval. The first one is by the scale reference. So if I give you an interval of say D and a B, you know that the lower note is a D, and you well know that the D major scale has two sharps, which are F sharp and C sharp, and the B note is a natural note in the key of D major. And we know that the diatonic intervals in a D major or any major key, the root and the sixth gives you a major sixth. Hence, D and the B is a major sixth. That is one way of identifying. Let me give you another example of this. So let's look at the E flat major scale. Say we want to identify the interval between E flat and D. Now we know that D is a natural in the E flat major scale, and diatonically the root and the seventh note of a E flat major scale is a major interval. Hence, E flat to D is a major seventh interval. The second method of naming the intervals comes into play when the lower note of the two notes given to you to identify the interval of is not a familiar note. And what I mean by that is, let's look at an example. Suppose we have a D sharp and a C. Now we don't know the D sharp major scale, but I know that whatever the gap is between the D sharp and C, if I lower both these notes by the same interval, a semitone, the gap between the two notes will stay the same. The only thing you need to take care of is that the note names should not be changed. So D sharp to C will become a D and a C flat, not a B. Because if you change it to B, then the number of interval will change and you will not arrive at the correct answer. So D sharp to C is whatever interval it is. We lower it to D and a C flat. Now we know that the D major scale has a C sharp in it, which is the major seventh. D to C sharp is a major seventh. D to C will be a minor seventh, and the D to C flat will be a diminished seventh. And lastly, there's a very interesting concept of the inversion of intervals. Now this is the third way of identifying an interval, and this typically comes into play when we are dealing with large intervals and the lower note of that large interval is not a familiar note. That means it is not an easy scale to identify with. For example, we have a C sharp and a B natural. Suppose C sharp and a B natural. Now C sharp major scale will again have 7 sharps, which is not commonly used. Commonly we use the D flat major and harmonic of it. Let's take one of these notes and jump it an octave. So instead of doing the C sharp to B, let's take the C sharp up here, and it will now become B to C sharp. Now B to C sharp is very easy to name because we know the B major scale has a C sharp in it. It is a major second, but when I invert it, that second becomes a seventh. So here are the rules of inverting an interval. When you invert any interval, the original interval and the inverted interval will always add up to 9. Let me give you some examples of this. C to E is a third, E to C is a sixth. Similarly, C to F is a fourth, F to C is a fifth. 4 plus 5, 9. C to A is a sixth, A to C is a third. 6 plus 3, 9. C to C is a unison, and C to C is an eighth. 8 plus 1, 9. So whenever you invert an interval within an octave, it will always add up to 9. Next thing is that the quality of the interval, what happens to that? When you invert a major interval, you will get a minor. When you invert a minor, you will get a major. Let's look at examples of that. C to A is a major sixth, A to C is a minor third. Let's look at another one. C to E flat is a minor third, E flat to C is a major sixth. When we invert a perfect interval, it stays perfect. Perfect unison becomes a perfect eighth. Perfect fourth becomes a perfect fifth. Perfect fifth becomes a perfect fourth. And finally, the diminished and the augmented. Like the major and the minor, the diminished augmented also work the similar way. Any augmented interval when inverted will become a diminished, and any diminished interval when inverted will become an augmented. So let's look at the example of that. C to F sharp, augmented fourth. F sharp to C, diminished fifth. C to B double flat is diminished seventh. B double flat to C is augmented second. So far we have been looking at intervals all within an octave, but as soon as we go beyond an octave, that becomes a compound interval. Let me show you an example of this. C to E is a major third. C to E above is actually a major tenth, but it can be called a compound major third. Now, why would we want to call it a tenth? In jazz harmony, we use extended chords. So that is the seventh chord, and we use notes above it, which are the 9th, 11th, and the 13th. So those are typically called the 9th, 11th, and the 13th, although they basically can be called the compound second, compound fourth, and compound sixth. I hope this was a good insight into how the intervals function. And do post in the comments what did you think about this video, and if I missed on any important aspect of this topic. And also let me know if there are any interesting topics that you would want me to cover in future videos. Thank you so much, and see you again.